The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky with shades of orange as the bustling streets near the convention center quieted down. The air was thick with anticipation for the upcoming international summit, and security had never been tighter. Law enforcement from every branch, local and federal, patrolled the area, ensuring no threats would disturb the high-profile event. In a quiet corner of the security perimeter, an unmarked black SUV slowly rolled to a stop. A man stepped out, tall, well-built, and dressed in a simple light jacket, jeans, and sneakers. His name was Ethan Davis, a 40-year-old special agent with the FBI. His job was to monitor the area, check for potential threats, and ensure everything ran smoothly before the summit began. Ethan was careful not to attract attention. He wasn't in uniform, just blending in with the crowd. It was his style, professional but discreet. As he moved through the area, scanning for any signs of trouble, he was careful not to stand out. But despite his efforts, Lindsey Harris, a local police officer stationed nearby, noticed him. Lindsey was 45 years old and had been with the force for over 2 decades. A no-nonsense veteran, she'd seen her share of suspects and criminals. But deep down, she held an uncomfortable prejudice against people who didn't fit her view of what was safe or normal. When her eyes landed on Ethan, dressed in plain clothes and moving purposefully near a restricted area, her instincts immediately flagged him as suspicious. Without hesitation, she strode toward him. "Hey, you!" she called out sharply, her voice firm. Ethan turned, his face calm but guarded. "Yes, officer." Lindsey crossed her arms, scanning him from head to toe. "What are you doing here? This area is off limits. You don't belong here." Ethan remained composed. "I'm just conducting a sweep to ensure everything's secure. No harm done." Lindsey's gaze hardened. "I don't care what you're doing. This is a restricted area, and you need to leave now." Ethan's expression remained neutral. "I'm not causing trouble, officer. Maybe you should check with the security team before jumping to conclusions." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What security team? You don't even have a badge. No identification. You're just a guy lurking around. I don't trust you." Ethan could feel the tension rising. He knew what this was about. Lindsey wasn't just suspicious. Her tone revealed something deeper. Bias. He wasn't going to escalate things, but he couldn't ignore her attitude. "I understand you're doing your job, but there's no need to be rude," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lindsey stepped closer, her face tightening with anger. "Rude? You think I'm being rude? I've been on this job for 20 years and I know trouble when I see it. You're not fooling me." Ethan took a slow breath, keeping his posture relaxed. "I'm not here to argue, officer, but you should know, I'm not your enemy." Lindsey's eyes flashed with frustration. "I don't need some random guy telling me how to do my job. You're just another one of them, aren't you? Always showing up where you're not wanted." The words stung, but Ethan kept his composure. He wasn't here to engage in a fight. "Officer, I think you've got the wrong idea. I'm just doing my job." The standoff continued as a few bystanders began to notice the rising tension. Lindsey, however, was too caught up in her anger to care. Her grip tightened, and she leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Leave now, or I'll have you arrested for obstruction." Ethan took a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. He didn't want to escalate things, but he couldn't let her walk all over him either. "I don't think you want to do that, officer, but if you insist, I'll have to call my supervisor." Lindsey's eyes narrowed as Ethan calmly reached into his jacket pocket. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the tension escalating. His movement was deliberate, slow and measured, as he pulled out his phone and began dialing. "Don't you dare," she hissed, stepping closer, her hand inching toward her holstered weapon. "Put that phone down now." Ethan kept his gaze locked on hers, unfazed. "I'm calling my supervisor. There's no need for this to go any further, officer." His voice was steady, but there was a subtle edge that suggested he was ready to escalate if necessary. He continued to dial, watching her closely. Lindsey's face reddened as she took another step toward him. "I said, put the phone down. Now!" Her voice was sharp and desperate, the threat of losing control creeping into her words. Ethan could feel the panic in her eyes, but he didn't flinch. He placed the phone to his ear, his tone still calm. "Sheriff Reynolds, this is Ethan Davis. I'm in the restricted zone near the summit venue. and there's a problem with one of your officers. I need you here." The moment the words left his mouth, Lindsey lost it. Without warning, she whipped her gun out and pointed it at him, her hands shaking slightly as she aimed it toward his chest. The metallic click of the weapon being drawn echoed in the silent air, and the bystanders, who had been quietly watching the confrontation, froze in fear. A few people gasped, stepping back, but Ethan didn't move. His hands stayed at his sides, palms open, his posture calm but resolute. His eyes never left Lindsey's. "Officer, you need to lower that weapon," he said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't the way to handle things." Lindsey's breath quickened. "I don't need you telling me what to do," she snarled. "Get on your knees now." Ethan's heart rate barely increased, though his mind raced. He had seen far worse in his career: shootouts, hostage situations, threats of all kinds. But this was different. This was a woman who had let her own prejudices and insecurities guide her actions, and he wasn't about to let it get any worse. "I'm not a criminal, and you know that," he said evenly, his gaze never wavering. "Put the gun down, Officer Harris. There's no need for this." Lindsey's fingers tightened on the trigger. She was shaking now, a mix of anger and fear bubbling up inside her. "I told you to get on the ground," she shouted, her voice unsteady. "Do it now." Instead of complying, Ethan slowly pulled his own phone from his pocket again. He dialed the number with careful precision, ensuring that the motion didn't startle her. He raised the phone to his ear and waited for the call to connect. He could feel the weight of the gun still aimed at him, but his demeanor remained calm and controlled. "Sheriff Reynolds? It's Ethan again. I need immediate assistance. Officer Harris has pulled a gun on me." Lindsey's face contorted with rage, but she didn't respond. Her finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger. "You're going to regret this," she spat. But just as she said that, the sound of sirens pierced the air, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. The sharp hum of the approaching patrol car grew louder, and within moments, Sheriff Reynolds' vehicle screeched to a halt nearby. The sheriff, an older man with a stern expression, stepped out of his car, his eyes immediately locking onto the gun that Lindsey was still pointing at Ethan. His voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" he demanded, striding toward them. Lindsey, caught off guard by the arrival of her superior, hesitated, her eyes flicking between Ethan and Sheriff Reynolds. Her grip on the weapon loosened slightly, but she didn't lower it. "Chief, this guy is a troublemaker," she stammered, though the words lacked conviction. Sheriff Reynolds, his eyes cold with authority, didn't flinch. "Put the gun down, Lindsey," he ordered, his voice icy. "Now." The hesitation in Lindsey's eyes was palpable, but she reluctantly lowered the weapon, her hands shaking as she holstered it. The crowd, which had been silently watching, let out a collective breath. Ethan, still standing tall, didn't flinch, his posture unwavering as the sheriff stepped forward to address him. "Ethan, I'm sorry about this. We'll take it from here." Ethan nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on Lindsey, who was still trying to maintain her composure. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. The tension in the air hung heavy as Sheriff Reynolds stepped closer to Ethan, his expression one of genuine regret. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly, his eyes briefly flicking to the crowd that had gathered. "I never expected Lindsey to react like that. I'll handle this." Ethan nodded, his expression still calm, but there was a glint of disappointment in his eyes. He hadn't flinched, hadn't escalated the situation, but he knew things couldn't end here. Not for Lindsey and not for the department. He had seen this kind of behavior before. Disrespect, prejudice, unchecked authority. It had to change. As Sheriff Reynolds turned his attention to Lindsey, who was standing stiffly, her face flushed with humiliation, Ethan stepped back. The sheriff's voice was firm. "Lindsey, I need you to step aside. Now." Lindsey's gaze flicked nervously between Ethan and the sheriff, her lips tight with frustration. She tried to mask her fear with bravado. "This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job." But there was no conviction in her words. She knew she had crossed a line, and now the reality of it was setting in. Reynolds didn't reply. He simply turned to his deputy and gestured for him to take Lindsey away from the scene. As the deputy escorted her to a nearby squad car, Ethan couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and sadness. He had been in countless dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a threat to his safety. It was a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained prejudice could be, even in people sworn to protect and serve. The sheriff turned back to him, his expression softer now. "Ethan, I want to personally apologize for what happened. I'll make sure this doesn't go unaddressed." His voice was sincere, but there was a hint of unease beneath the calm exterior. "I'll take care of her. This shouldn't have happened." Ethan appreciated the apology, but the words didn't quite reach him. "Sheriff, I don't need you to apologize for me," he said, his voice steady. "What I need is for this kind of behavior to be taken seriously. I don't want any more officers out here acting like Lindsey did, judging people based on appearances or assumptions." Reynolds nodded, a grim expression crossing his face. "You're right. We've got work to do. We'll make sure something like this never happens again." He paused, looking over at the crowd that had begun to disperse. "This whole situation was handled terribly. I'll be investigating this further, and I promise there will be consequences." Ethan's gaze lingered on the spot where Lindsey had stood. The situation had been handled, but the consequences were far from over. This wasn't just a matter of one rogue officer. It was a sign of a bigger issue that needed to be addressed. He didn't want to see anyone else go through what he had, not because of his own dignity, but because of the larger problem it represented. As the sheriff walked away, making calls to follow up on the situation, Ethan stood there for a moment longer, deep in thought. He had been calm, professional, and patient, but he knew this wouldn't end with a simple apology. It couldn't. Within the hour, Lindsey was escorted away from the scene, her badge and gun now in the hands of the deputy who had accompanied her. The crowd that had watched the encounter seemed to have melted away, but the murmurs of disbelief and outrage still lingered in the air. The video of the incident had already begun to spread, and it wasn't long before news outlets picked up the story. In the days that followed, the footage went viral. Public outrage erupted, and many demanded accountability from both the police department and the city leadership. The media coverage was relentless, and Lindsey's actions were exposed for all to see. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. There would be investigations, interviews, and public scrutiny. But he also knew that this incident, as painful as it was, could be the catalyst for change. He hoped it would be a turning point, not just for Lindsey or the department, but for the city as a whole. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of media frenzy and public outcry. The video of Officer Lindsey Harris pulling her weapon on Ethan Davis had gone viral, sparking outrage not only in the local community, but across the country. The footage, with its stark portrayal of racial bias and abuse of authority, became a symbol of everything wrong with a system that allowed such behavior to persist. Ethan had never wanted the attention. He had only wanted to do his job quietly and professionally, but now his name was all over the news. People were calling him a hero, but Ethan knew better than to buy into the praise. He had been put in an impossible situation, forced to handle something that should never have happened in the first place. His role wasn't about being a symbol, it was about making sure the system worked, that justice was done. The pressure was now on Sheriff Reynolds and the department to respond. Public opinion had turned sharply against Lindsey Harris, and many were demanding accountability. For her part, Lindsey had been suspended from duty while an internal investigation was launched. But the damage to her reputation was already done. No one knew how things would unfold for her, but one thing was clear: her career, her life had been irrevocably altered. In an interview with the local news, Sheriff Reynolds addressed the situation with rare transparency. "What happened here was wrong. The actions of Officer Harris do not represent the values of this department, and I am deeply disturbed by what transpired. I will ensure that a full investigation is conducted and any necessary actions will be taken. This type of behavior has no place in law enforcement." Despite the sheriff's efforts to maintain control of the narrative, the scrutiny only intensified. The police department came under fire from activists, politicians, and concerned citizens. People were questioning how such behavior could have been allowed to fester within the force, and many were calling for widespread reform. Meanwhile, Lindsey, now the subject of intense criticism, was forced to face the consequences of her actions. The department had already begun the process of reviewing her entire record, and soon the full scope of her past conduct would come to light. The investigation was thorough, an examination of her behavior on the force, including allegations of racial profiling and abuse of power. No stone was left unturned. The final decision came just a few weeks later. Lindsey Harris was terminated from the police force, her badge and gun stripped away. The public largely supported the decision, but a small faction of her supporters still clung to the notion that she had been unjustly persecuted. They argued that she had simply been doing her job, that the pressure of the moment had led to her poor judgment. But for most people, the evidence was undeniable. Ethan, who had kept a low profile throughout the ordeal, was offered an interview by several major news outlets. Despite the praise, he declined most of the offers, choosing instead to focus on his mission and his responsibilities within the FBI. However, he did make a brief statement to the Washington Post, offering his perspective on the events. "I didn't want anyone's career or life to be ruined over this," he said. "But the truth is, what happened should never have happened in the first place. We need to confront the way we treat each other, especially when it comes to law enforcement. This is bigger than one person or one incident. We need systemic change." His words resonated with many, and the conversation about police reform gained more traction. For Ethan, the ordeal wasn't just about his own experience. It was about pushing for a change in how law enforcement interacted with the communities they were sworn to protect. As the weeks passed, the city began to slowly heal from the wounds of that fateful day. The department, under Sheriff Reynolds' leadership, implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation, cultural competency, and racial bias. An independent oversight board was established to handle complaints of abuse and misconduct, aiming to ensure that incidents like this would be addressed swiftly and transparently in the future. But while reforms were taking shape, the scars of Lindsey Harris's actions remained. Her reputation, once built on years of service, was now tarnished beyond repair. She found herself isolated, unable to find work in law enforcement or security. Her apology, given in a tearful interview on a local TV station, was seen by many as too little, too late. "I didn't think it would go this far," she said, her voice breaking. "I was wrong, and I'm paying the price for it. I never meant to hurt anyone." But in the end, the public and her former colleagues knew the price was far more than she could afford. Months passed since the incident with Officer Lindsey Harris, and the city was slowly beginning to heal. The public reaction had been swift and intense. The video of Harris pulling a gun on Ethan Davis becoming a symbol of the deep issues plaguing law enforcement. What had started as one man's unfortunate encounter had evolved into a national conversation on racial bias, police accountability, and the urgent need for reform. Ethan, though still processing the ordeal, had quietly gone back to work at the FBI. The media frenzy had died down, but the weight of what had happened never quite left him. He was now more determined than ever to continue his work and push for change, even if it meant facing more difficult situations like the one he had endured with Lindsey Harris. Sheriff Reynolds, too, had faced the aftermath of the scandal. The public outcry had forced his hand, pushing him to implement real changes in the police department. New training programs were introduced, focusing on de-escalation tactics and the recognition of racial biases. An independent oversight board was formed, giving the public a way to file complaints against officers. It was a start, but everyone knew that meaningful change would take time. For Lindsey Harris, the consequences of her actions had been swift and harsh. Despite her apologies, her career was over. She had been terminated from the police department, her badge and gun taken from her. Her name became synonymous with prejudice and abuse of power, and the viral video ensured that her reputation would never recover. She tried to rebuild her life, but doors continued to close, and the shame of what she had done lingered over her. But Ethan, despite everything, had never wanted this to be about him. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He had only wanted to do his job and to make sure that people, regardless of their background, were treated fairly. He knew that real change didn't come from one incident. It came from a collective effort, from people choosing to do better, day by day. One afternoon, as Ethan sat at his desk at the FBI, reviewing case files, his phone rang. It was Sheriff Reynolds. "Ethan," the sheriff's voice was serious, but there was a note of gratitude in it. "I just wanted to personally thank you for how you handled everything. You've set an example for all of us, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure something like that never happens again." Ethan leaned back in his chair, taking a moment before responding. I appreciate that, Sheriff, but this isn't about me. It's about making sure the system works for everyone, not just some people. The sheriff paused, then spoke again, his voice a little softer. I know, and we're working on it. But I want you to know, you've made a difference. I don't know if we could have gotten here without your example. Ethan nodded, grateful for the recognition, but not one to dwell on it. I just want to see real change, not just promises. Real change. That's the plan, the sheriff replied. We'll keep pushing. After the call ended, Ethan felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. There was still work to be done. More reforms, more awareness, more conversations about how to treat each other with respect and dignity. But at least for now, there was progress. There was hope. As Ethan looked out his office window, the city seemed different. There was a sense of possibility in the air, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. It was a long road ahead, but Ethan was ready for it. He had learned that no matter how difficult the journey, standing firm in the face of injustice was always worth it. And so, with a deep breath, he returned to his work. The mission wasn't over.